The inclination to make poems exists in everyone, but I alone have truly grasped rich, exquisite scenes. Singing of flowers beneath the moon, I love what's still and pale, or writing of willows at rainy dawn, compose on angled fringe. Green jade has long been kept away, hidden in secret depths, and yet I've always written as I pleased, on scarlet slips. The Tang Dynasty was a time of peace and prosperity, cultural exchange, and positive romanticism, in which people rejoiced in their passion and feeling. Tang poetry was also more dense than earlier poetry, both in its wording and in the figurative language used. It sought to encapsulate clear, specific, impactful images, and found a large portion of its meaning through symbolic imagery. For Chinese women, the Tang Dynasty was the peak of their social rights and freedoms in imperial China. Specifically, women who wanted to pursue creative endeavors such as poetry and music had options for occupations that would allow them to do so in the public eye. Some women became courtesans who were expected to entertain government or military officials, both intellectually and sensually. Other women became Taoist nuns, who had a surprisingly large amount of freedom due to the heavy presence of feminine deities and concepts in Taoism, and the active participation of women welcomed there. Both courtesans and Taoist nuns spent much of their time on literary and artistic pursuits. So how did the combination of increased maturity of Tang poetry and increased social freedoms of women affect how women express themselves through poetry? Poetry in the Tang was considered to be a full representation of the author's consciousness, to the point that they are treated by scholars as historically accurate records of the author's life. As such, poetry written by men from the perspective of women still bore intentional markers of the author's true identity, rather than trying to actually replicate the voice of a woman. Men might write from the perspective of a woman to express their desire or to identify with certain aspects of the female persona, such as emotion and dramatization. But there is usually some indicator of separation from the true female persona. As Maureen Robertson puts it, in poems of desire, men take on a literati feminine voice to indicate the eye of the voyeur in their presentation of passive, narcissistic women, romanticized suffering, and displays and inventories of boudoir furnishings and clothing. This is shown in the following poem by Liu Huan, which not only depicts the female as an object, but also depicts a void for a man to occupy. I cannot endure the endlessness of cold nights, night after night as keeper of this empty bed. My skirt is pressed in folds from sitting. The hairpin's shadow grows as I lean toward the lamp. He cares not for my beautiful deep quilts. What use is incense in an atmosphere like this? Robertson goes on to claim that in these times the reader was always assumed to be male and addressed as such. So how could women find ways to address women readers using a shift in voice? Robertson argues the main four aspects that mattered were subversion of symbolism, a difference in the reader's gaze, the topics that were broached, and ambiguity in voicing when addressing other women. Women used these to produce poetic voices that served their own purposes. As an example, Xuanji, a prominent female Tang poet, employs some of these strategies in her poem Presented to the Girl Next Door, which may have been sent to a neighbor girl as consolation for her recent heartbreak. Shying from the sun, I shade myself with gauze sleeves, made melancholy by spring, too listless to rise and put on my makeup. It's easy to seek a priceless treasure, but hard to find a man with a heart. I let my tears fall unseen on my pillow. I'm secretly downcast among the flowers. But if I can steal glances at Songyu, why should I regret Wang Chang? Symbolism falling into the classic boudoir scenario is repeated here. The gauze sleeves of the neighbor girl, her makeup and pillow, all might be used in a sensual manner in a boudoir poem to give the reader a sense of her surroundings and introduce longing for a man to fill the space. However, instead of being used as inviting aesthetics, the symbolism in this poem illustrates the girl's sorrow over her recent heartbreak, distinct from a desire for a man's company. Thus, Yu neutralizes the reader's gaze, causing the reader's possible perception of the poem to change from sexual and desirous to non-sexual and neutral. She also broaches topical territory unexplored in typical poems of desire, the neighbor girl's inferred frustration at not being able to find a man with a heart, and a note of optimism to end the poem, as Yu tells the girl there are better options out there and she should not remain hung up on past lovers. Finally, throughout the poem, Yu's voice is reminiscent of the literati feminine voice, but in this case, it's used to show platonic closeness and to express the girl's loneliness rather than sensuality. Apart from differences in voice, there was also a difference in how men treated women's flaws from the outside and how flawed women wrote about themselves. To the typical male poet in Tang China, a woman's imperfection must either add to her attractiveness or it must ultimately be rectified. Yin Ying Zuan is a short story written by Tang poet Yuan Zhen that is generally agreed to be based on a true story and real-life people. In it, the main romantic interest, Cui Yingying, is portrayed as blatantly immoral for going against Confucian values to initiate romance with the male character, Zhang. At the beginning of the story, she presents herself to Zhang in a purposely disheveled state. She wore everyday clothes and had a disheveled appearance without having dressed up especially for the occasion. Tresses from the coils of her hair hung down to her eyebrows, and her two cheeks were suffused with rosy color. Zhang goes on to express his attraction towards her, fueled partly by her imperfect presentation of herself. In contrast, Xuanji writes about her imperfect appearance and tousled hair in a neutral manner, in a context that is supposed to reveal her wandering thoughts, not paint her as an object of desire. I pull out my hairpin. It shines in the rippling current. I lie on the bed, my books spread everywhere, and then, half drunk, I rise and comb my hair. By the end of Yin Ying Zuan, Zhang moves on from Yin Ying and effectively calls her an evil seductress. Unable to get over him, she becomes a shell of her former self and spends her days in self-pity and meek acceptance of her fate. The story paints this as a justified ending for her. In the words of Lorraine Dong, Yin Ying is no longer fighting against society, but has once more become a part of its moral standards when she feels that what she has done is wrong and forgives Zhang for seducing and betraying her. In this sense, Yin Ying does not feel defeated by society, as much as that, drowned in her own self-pity and without any reinforcement from the outside, society is right after all, and that she has wrongfully gone astray. Xuanji, however, never admits that society is right after all. Throughout her poetry, her desire to be treated on an equal footing with male literati is never rectified, and she doesn't express a desire for it to be. Female poets during the Tang had strategies at their disposal to alter the audience's assumptions about both authorship and readership, but they wielded these strategies in different ways depending on their goals. Specifically, Yu Xuanji and Xue Tao's constructed voices represented two different ways to find self-expression through poetry in the context of the social confines of the period. Yu Xuanji was a concubine turned Taoist nun who lived approximately from 844 to 868 AD. She's portrayed as strong-willed and sexually independent through her poetry, and was executed at the age of 24 for purportedly beating her maid to death in a fit of rage. I entrust my bitterness to a lute's crimson strings, hold back passion, my thoughts unbearable. Long ago I knew that a cloud-rain meeting would not give rise to an orchid heart. Fresh and shining, the peach and the plum, nothing prevents eminent scholars from seeking them out. Gray-green, the pine and the cassia, still they long for honor from the people of the age. The moon's hue is pure on mossy steps. Song comes from deep within the bamboo garden. Before my gate, ground covered with red leaves, I don't sweep them away, waiting for one who understands me. In this poem, Yu acknowledges her sexual appeal to other men. The peach and the plum represent marriageable women, and she admits that there is no shortage of men desiring her for her conventionally attractive qualities. Yet she expresses a deep dissatisfaction with how she is perceived by others. To her, a cloud-rain meeting, a common euphemism for sexual relations, does not give rise to an orchid heart, signifying an upright and virtuous mind. She is dissatisfied even if men want her for her sexual or romantic value. Instead, what she desires is honor from the people of the age, recognition for her literary talent, and a chance to converse deeply with one who recognizes her as his intellectual equal. This is further reinforced by her usage of the pine and the cassia, symbolism for enduring partners, not necessarily in a romantic sense. Often the phrase was also used by men to refer to their relationship with their literary patrons, and this is closer to the context in which she is using the phrase here. Thus, despite directly addressing feminine experiences through symbolism involving peaches, plums, clouds, and rain, Yu neutralizes the reader's gaze so as to read the poem not in a sexual context, but in the context of her longing for intellectual understanding. She is even more explicit in another poem. Cloud-covered hilltops fill my eyes. I revel in springtime light. Here, clearly ranged, are the silver hooks that grew at their fingertips. I have bitter regret that skirts of lace hide the lines of my poems, and lifting my head in vain, I covet the publicly posted name. Once again, Yu does not shy away from mentioning her femininity, her skirts of lace. Simultaneously, she addresses the issue of gender inequality head-on and admits her envy of the men who are able to take the literary examination. Envy, an undesirable emotion that adds to her imperfection, which she addresses openly and neutrally with no shame but also no projection of desire attached, as in Yin Ying Zuan. Themes of gender inequality, feminine symbolism, and free expression of passion and emotion feature prominently in Xuanji's poetry. All of these markers make her identity as a woman clear, yet she constructs a masculinized voice through neutralization of the reader's gaze to talk about these subjects, thus going directly against the social confines of her time. Xue Tao is another poet of the Tang Dynasty, who lived from 768 to around 832 AD, just before Yu Xuanji's time. She was a courtesan who used her extensive literary capabilities to establish herself in the circles of high-ranking state officials, and maintained regular correspondence with some of the most notable male poets of the time, such as Ranzhen and Bo Zhiyi. Xue Tao rarely directly broaches the topics of gender inequality and free expression of passion that Yu Xuanji does. Indeed, much of her poetry is indistinguishable from that of other male poets of the time on the basis of the author's gender. Xue valued convention and utilized many of the same motifs and imagery that other male poets of the time did. For instance, in a classic parting poem, of countless willows, one early autumn branch, windswept, earth draping, its colors remain. I'd break it off to make a farewell gift, so mist and moon at two spots will not feel sad. Xue incorporates the willow branch, a common symbol for parting. In the last line of the poem, she also brings to mind images of moonlight, cold, and empty space, all imagery conventionally used in parting poem. In another poem, she writes, lotus-laden, pushing through a single wind-blown leaf, sends forth the news, it's newly fall time again to fish. The moon hare runs, the sun crow flies, and human chatter stills. Pink-tinted sleeves fill up the brook, and polling songs begin. Many men wrote poetry about lotus-gathering women with lightly erotic overtones, and Xue Tao incorporates the same motifs without distinguishing her perspective from that of a man looking on at the woman's activities. She even makes a pun on fish and desire, and uses pink-tinted sleeves to refer both to the women's appealing clothing and the blossoms filling the river. This is a pattern throughout her poetry. As Jean Larson notes, in a number of Xue's poems, the use of a stock motif for a beautiful woman or courtesan, the willow, the bush warbler, the parrot, the flowering plum, acquires a particular interest once one knows the gender of the author. Xue tended to strictly follow poetic convention and a traditional masculinized voice. For her, it was not a limitation, but liberation. Working within the bounds of the period's conventions gave the reader a deeper understanding of her work through an implicit agreement between writer and audience. In addition, the use of convention implies membership in a community, specifically for Xue, the mid-Tang poetic community. This subversion of symbolism, using the same symbols and presenting the same gaze as other famous poetry of the time did, despite Xue's identity and perspective being inherently different from that of other male poets, constructed a poetic voice that allowed her to achieve a more equal standing with other male poets within the social confines of her time. This is in contrast to usage of her poetry to achieve liberation through going against the social confines of her time. So while both Xue Tao and Yu Xuanji constructed their voices in the interest of better serving their self-expression, the way they did so and their goals in doing so were different in the context of societal restrictions. For both women, however, poetry served as a vessel for emotion and self-expression, whether they constructed a voice that rejected convention and tradition or embraced it. a voice that reinforced the gender of its author or obscured it, a voice that sought freedom against social confines or sought freedom within social confines. Xuanji wrote of her poetry. Spring flowers and autumn moon enter my poems. Bright daylight, clear night, these belong to an immortal at ease. I do nothing but roll up my beaded blinds and never lower them. I've moved my couch for good so I can sleep facing the mountains.